New York City says it's crushing illegal mopeds and scooters to make the streets safer. But the reality on the ground tells a very different story. Officials roll out piles of seized bikes in front of cameras, flatten them with giant machines, and declare victory over crime, while thousands more are still flying through traffic with fake plates, no insurance, and no accountability. The city keeps telling people this crackdown is working, but every single day, New Yorkers continue seeing the same reckless riders weaving through intersections, racing down sidewalks, and disappearing after robberies before police can even react. According to the NYPD, many of these scooters and mopeds are being used in crimes ranging from snatch-and-grab robberies to organized theft rings operating across multiple boroughs. Police have linked groups of riders to daylight jewelry thefts, street robberies, and coordinated burglaries where suspects speed away before victims even understand what happened. Entire neighborhoods across Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and Staten Island are now dealing with a situation where these vehicles have become symbols of chaos, lawlessness, and a city struggling to maintain basic public order.
The problem is not that mopeds exist. Plenty of law-abiding people use them every day to commute to work, make deliveries, or avoid the nightmare of New York traffic. The real issue is that enforcement has collapsed to the point where criminals know they can operate with very little fear of consequences. Riders cruise through red lights, remove or cover their license plates, ride against traffic, and even take over sidewalks, while police often stand by, unable or unwilling to intervene. The message being sent to criminals is simple. The chances of getting caught are low, and even if you are caught, the consequences probably won't matter. City leaders continue presenting these moped-crushing events as bold action, but the numbers themselves tell another story entirely. Officials proudly announced that thousands of illegal scooters and mopeds had already been confiscated this year alone. Yet, despite all those seizures, residents continue reporting growing numbers of reckless riders all over the city. If enforcement is supposedly increasing while the problem keeps getting worse, that is not evidence of success. That is evidence the city is losing control faster than it can respond.
What makes this situation even more frustrating for many residents is that this exact same photo op has happened before. Years ago, the city held almost identical events where confiscated mopeds were crushed in front of cameras to send a message. Then it happened again and again. Yet here we are, with even more illegal scooters flooding the streets than before. Crushing 200 mopeds might create dramatic television footage, but it does absolutely nothing to stop the endless stream of replacements appearing the very next day. The reason these vehicles became so attractive to criminals is obvious. They are fast, cheap, agile, and capable of escaping through narrow streets, sidewalks, bike lanes, and crowded intersections where patrol cars cannot follow. A suspect on a scooter can dart through traffic, disappear into alleys, and travel in directions police vehicles physically cannot go. Some of these bikes can hit speeds of 50 or 60 miles per hour, making them perfect getaway vehicles for opportunistic crimes carried out in broad daylight.
Meanwhile, police departments are trapped in a system where aggressive pursuits create political backlash and legal risks, meaning officers often cannot chase these riders through dense city streets. Criminals understand that. They know enforcement is limited, targeted, and inconsistent. Outside occasional crackdowns, riders with fake plates or no registration often travel openly throughout the city with little interference. That reality alone encourages more people to break the rules because they see others getting away with it every single day. This entire crisis also reflects something much bigger happening in New York City, a growing normalization of low-level lawlessness. Progressive politicians have spent years arguing that certain offenses should be deprioritized or decriminalized entirely. Shoplifting, disorderly conduct, reckless behavior, and repeat misdemeanor offenses increasingly receive lighter consequences or immediate release. The theory was that reducing enforcement on smaller crimes would allow authorities to focus on major violent offenses. Instead, critics argue the city created an environment where disorder spreads because people stop believing the rules actually matter.
Once that mindset takes hold, the effects multiply everywhere. If people see others running red lights without punishment, more drivers start doing it too. If riders travel without plates and face no consequences, others follow. If thieves are arrested and released immediately, repeat offenses become more common.
The mopeds themselves are not the root problem. They are simply one visible symptom of a larger collapse in deterrence, where more and more people conclude they can ignore laws because enforcement is inconsistent and penalties are weak. At the same time, ordinary New Yorkers are the ones trapped in the middle of this experiment. Business owners deal with repeated thefts. Residents worry about getting robbed while walking home. Drivers fear reckless riders weaving between lanes and causing accidents. Pedestrians constantly look over their shoulders when scooters approach from behind because they have seen countless videos of phones, jewelry, and bags being snatched in seconds. What used to feel shocking has become routine, and that normalization is perhaps the most dangerous development of all. Another major factor fueling the explosion of mopeds is the city's failing transportation system. The subway system continues suffering shutdowns, delays, signal problems, and constant service disruptions that frustrate commuters across the boroughs. Entire train lines shut down for weekends or overnight repairs, leaving residents scrambling for alternatives. When public transit becomes unreliable, people naturally start searching for faster and cheaper ways to move around the city. That is exactly why scooter and moped sales continue climbing. For many working-class residents, a scooter is one of the only affordable transportation options left. Cars are too expensive, insurance costs are outrageous, parking is impossible, public transit is unreliable. A cheap scooter suddenly becomes the easiest way to commute across town, especially for delivery workers trying to survive in an increasingly unaffordable city. Unfortunately, that same affordability also makes these vehicles extremely attractive to criminals, who can replace stolen or confiscated bikes quickly and cheaply. Gas-powered scooters can cost little more than $1,000, and stolen ones can circulate through underground markets even faster. Criminals lose one bike, steal another, swap a fake plate onto it, and continue operating almost immediately. That is why critics argue crushing confiscated mopeds accomplishes nothing meaningful. The city destroys them while new ones flood in constantly. The cycle never ends because the system addressing the underlying criminal behavior remains broken. There is also growing anger over reports that some city shelters and facilities effectively protect these scooters from enforcement. In some cases, large numbers of bikes have reportedly been parked inside fenced areas or shelter property, where police cannot simply tow them away like illegally parked vehicles on public streets. Critics see this as the city actively undermining its own enforcement efforts by creating safe storage zones for vehicles that may not even be legally registered.
To many frustrated residents, this contradiction perfectly represents the larger dysfunction consuming the city. Officials publicly condemn illegal scooters while simultaneously operating systems that indirectly shield them from enforcement. The city declares war on lawlessness while also creating policies critics say weaken accountability at every level. Residents watch these contradictions unfold and lose confidence that anyone in charge truly has control of the situation. Police departments themselves are also struggling with staffing shortages at exactly the worst possible time. Officers continue retiring, resigning, or leaving the force, while crime concerns remain high across many communities. Fewer officers on the streets means less proactive enforcement, slower response times, and reduced ability to monitor quality of life issues before they escalate into something more dangerous. As staffing drops, visible disorder becomes even harder to control. The consequences extend beyond crime statistics. They affect the psychological atmosphere of the city itself. When people constantly see reckless behavior going unchecked, they stop feeling secure in public spaces. Fear spreads gradually. Residents become more defensive, more suspicious, and more exhausted by daily life. Small incidents that once seemed unusual begin feeling completely normal, and that erosion of public confidence damages the social fabric of the city over time. Even people who obey the law can slowly become influenced by the environment around them. If riders constantly ignore traffic laws without punishment, others begin questioning why they should bother following the rules themselves. If nobody checks plates, insurance, or registration consistently, compliance drops. Lawlessness becomes contagious because visible non-enforcement sends the signal that standards no longer exist. Once that culture spreads, restoring order becomes dramatically more difficult. The city's political leadership continues insisting progress is being made, but many residents simply do not believe it anymore.
They hear speeches about crackdowns while watching the exact same reckless behavior continue outside their apartment windows every night. They see press conferences celebrating seizures while videos of robberies involving scooters keep going viral online. They hear promises about public safety while feeling increasingly unsafe walking through their own neighborhoods.
What makes the situation even more complicated is that not every rider is a criminal. Thousands of delivery workers depend on these vehicles to earn a living. Many immigrants and low-income residents use scooters because they are the only transportation option they can realistically afford. Blanket crackdowns risk punishing law-abiding riders alongside criminals, which creates another political and logistical nightmare for city officials trying to balance enforcement with practicality. Still, critics argue the city already knows exactly which scooters are problematic. Vehicles with fake plates, no registration, altered VIN numbers, or no insurance are obvious targets for enforcement. Instead of occasional publicity stunts, opponents want consistent day-to-day enforcement focused on removing illegal vehicles immediately whenever they appear. They argue that visible enforcement creates deterrence, while sporadic crackdowns simply encourage criminals to wait things out.
Others argue the city should stop destroying confiscated scooters entirely. Instead of crushing them for scrap metal, critics believe properly seized vehicles could be auctioned or resold legally after verification and processing. At a time when New York constantly complains about budget issues and affordability crises, many people see it as absurd to destroy usable vehicles rather than recover some financial value from them. The broader transportation crisis only makes the future look even more unstable. New York continues pushing policies that discourage car ownership while simultaneously failing to provide reliable subway service. Bike lanes expand, congestion pricing increases costs for drivers, subway shutdowns continue. Naturally, more residents turn towards scooters, e-bikes, and mopeds as survival tools in a city where traditional transportation options increasingly feel broken.
That means the number of scooters on the streets will likely keep rising, whether officials like it or not. As long as commuting remains expensive and public transit remains unreliable, demand for cheap personal transportation will continue growing. Without strong enforcement and accountability, the criminal misuse of those vehicles will continue growing alongside legitimate use, creating an even bigger challenge for the future. At its core, this entire debate is really about whether New York City still believes in enforcing order consistently. Critics argue the city spent years minimizing low-level offenses, weakening deterrence, and creating policies that unintentionally rewarded disorder. Supporters of current policies argue aggressive enforcement creates its own problems and disproportionately impacts vulnerable communities. The result is a city deeply divided over what public safety should actually look like.
Meanwhile, everyday residents are stuck living through the consequences of that political battle. They are the ones navigating dangerous intersections, unreliable subways, rising crime fears, and streets filled with riders operating outside the rules. They are the ones watching quality of life deteriorate, while leaders argue endlessly over ideology, enforcement, and optics. The truth is that crushing mopeds may create dramatic headlines, but headlines do not restore public confidence. Real change would require consistent enforcement, functioning transit systems, meaningful consequences for repeat offenders, and policies focused on restoring trust in the rule of law. Without those deeper structural changes, these crushing events will remain exactly what many critics already believe they are: expensive public relations performances that solve absolutely nothing.
Until New York addresses the underlying conditions driving both the demand for mopeds and the criminal misuse surrounding them, this cycle will continue repeating itself. More scooters will flood the streets, more riders will ignore the rules, more residents will feel unsafe, more businesses will suffer losses, and eventually, more people may decide they simply do not want to live in a city where disorder feels permanent. That is the real danger facing New York right now. Not just the scooters themselves, but the growing belief that nobody is truly in control anymore. Because once people lose faith that laws are enforced fairly and consistently, the entire foundation of public order begins to weaken. And rebuilding that trust after it collapses is far harder than crushing a few hundred mopeds in front of cameras.